everybody, welcome to Our Culture Gaming. I'm Scott, joined by Josh.
Hello, Scott.
Josh, my friend, your friend and mine, Dusk Golem / Aesthetic Gamer, one of the most known leakers in the industry, responsible for various things in regards to Resident Evil, Silent Hill, etc. over the years, is now talking about future Capcom plans, future announcements, one major announcement coming later this year, and also talking about Resident Evil 9 going forward. Dusk Golem mentioning various things over on Discord, saying that he knows some Capcom stuff, some Square Enix stuff, and some Sega stuff. In regards to Resident Evil, he says that he knows the Resident Evil plans all the way up until 2029, and that there'll be a Resident Evil 9 likely announced next year and then released in 2025. And then alongside that, he says that Capcom are announcing a major game later this year to be launched in fall next year. So there's a lot going on.
It's interesting. I think Capcom generally is in an interesting position right now because they have gone from strength to strength, dropped all of these really interesting games, but their lineup generally is kind of unknown, and it's been a while since their roadmap has kind of been this obfuscated, which is kind of exciting, but also like, what are they going to do? Are they going to drop Exoprimal 2 in a year's time? Probably not, but Resident Evil 9 obviously is something I'm very excited about. I'm a huge fan of Resident Evil generally, but 7 and 8 were great games in my opinion, and my big question is, when this drops, maybe in 2025, is it going to continue that style of game, or is it going to return to the third-person, over-the-shoulder gameplay that has found, obviously, huge success in Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 4's Remake?
And in Resident Evil 8's DLC. I mean, I think they've been teasing that for a while, like a return to the third-person stuff. It's one of those things for us down in the comments whether you prefer first-person Resident Evil or third-person. I'm a third boy.
I like both.
I just want the third. I want to see my dude. But I thought we'd run down the various things that this could be, and we'll wrap back around to Resident Evil 9 as we go. I think, and I'm just hoping, I'm crossing the fingers, I'm praying to the gods, that it's about time for Dino Crisis. I know they abandoned the trademark in 2021, but one of the characters in Exoprimal is literally Regina. Like, what are we doing? She's got red hair, she's talking about dinosaurs, she's in a dinosaur-based game. You've got people thinking about Dino Crisis. Just put it out.
Been saying that for 5 years, though, is the issue, haven't we? Like, I want to see Dino Crisis. I want to see that game come back, whether it's a remake or whether it's a completely new take on that IP. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I just can't see it. I want it to happen, but it's like me asking for a Code Veronica remake. Like, that might happen, but I don't know if they'll do that because it seems obvious, but it's not as obvious as like a Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 4 remake. You know, these games which people are still talking about today and which sold loads at the time. I wonder if it's only old fogies like you and I who care about Dino Crisis, and if they put all the time into it, it wouldn't sell. I'd like to think it would. I don't know.
You think about where dinosaurs are in pop culture, the Jurassic World movies.
I've never thought about where dinosaurs are, but I'm excited where this goes. Tell me.
That whole series of movies, the most recent trilogy, obviously they were terrible critically, quality-wise, whatever, but the only reason they did remotely well until the very last one where it fell the F off was because it's dinosaurs. People like dinosaurs in media. Why not put them in more games? There's very little going on. Ark Survival Evolved, people are a big fan of that.
Good point.
Why not just do a Resident Evil 2 or 3 style, the remake ones, style of game of Dino Crisis, do it in the RE engine, and have lots of really cool gore effects and T-Rexes coming through the wall and everything. Just do it!
I'd like it. You know what? I'm not going to say I wouldn't like it. I just don't know if they would put the money into it when we're still waiting on games like Devil May Cry 6, which seemed like perhaps a more shoot-a-fire bet. I wouldn't, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. The games that we've had from Capcom in terms of their remakes, have they only remade games so far from the Resident Evil franchise? I can't think of one off the top of my head.
With that level of
from
quality,
another series, So would they go to Dino Crisis, or would they maybe go back to Devil May Cry 1? Remake that in like 5's engine? I don't know.
I don't want that. I don't know. I think, in terms of like the overall production quality, I feel like the Resident Evil remakes, I mean the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes, and 4 remakes, not the original Resident Evil remake, which is another thing that this could be. That's been talked about quite a lot, the idea of taking the RE engine, RE234 approach, and doing that with the original Spencer Mansion Resident Evil, because it's been remade before, but it was in the isometric, more sort of static fixed camera approach, and doing that with an over-shoulder camera or something. Do you want something like that?
Hilariously, no, because I think the Resident Evil 1 remake is still like a perfect game, and of course, you could reinvent it like you did the originals for 2 and 3, give it that massive overhaul like you just mentioned, mentioned, I of course would buy it. I'd be there day one because I love Resident Evil that much. But to me, there are other games that would make for more interesting remakes. I already mentioned Code Veronica. I'd even like to see Resident Evil 5 and see how they kind of tackle that game within the reboot timeline that they've established.
Yes.
You know, the remake of 4 is way more linked to the events of 2 than the original kind of ever was. There are way more direct kind of crossovers and continuations of Leon's arc. So I want to see how that would go into 5 with Chris and with Wesker and all of that, all overly stuff. But it's interesting because I think it was earlier this year when Capcom released a survey essentially asking fans, what game would you like to see remade next?
What should we do?
Yeah, what should we do? And I'm pretty sure Code Veronica and 5 were both on there,
Yep.
maybe with a few others.
I think Dino Crisis was on there too.
Was it really?
I think so.
There you go. Maybe
I just imagined it. I was
Yeah.
seeing it that much.
I would like to see all of them, of course I would. I just think it would make sense. If they've already gone 2, 3, 4, the next one, in my opinion, will be 5.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that for a little bit because the sort of remixed timeline, the way that they've been able to reapproach all these new remakes, like I said, like 2, 3, 4 have way more connective tissue, have way more like an authored feel. You can kind of just play them in a row and it makes sense.
Yes.
They all kind of go into each other. Better, arguably better than the original rollout did, just because with the benefit of hindsight, they can stitch those together a bit more. 5 is the one that I feel was, like, I mean, 4 had a divisive response at the time, even though it is one of the best games of all time, but there was always that hardcore contingent of Resident Evil fans going like, it's not Resident Evil.
Yeah.
And then 5 was even more in that direction, and then obviously 6 as well was the one that made everybody kind of go, we can't do this anymore.
Yes.
So for me, those are the biggest challenges to overturn. Those are the biggest things to reapproach and use the design lessons, use the gameplay lessons from, especially the 4 remake, which is the most action-heavy one so far. They still found a way to make that nicely horror-based towards the first half.
Yeah.
And then sort of tick the action box later. Like, I think you can do that with RE5, and then I personally would love to see them try and do 6 again. That game is fascinating in terms of when it came out. There's like 4 campaigns in it, or 5 campaigns in it, and they try and tick the horror box, they try and tick the action box, and at the time it was just like this massive mess. But I'm just curious, do they have the cojones to try that once more?
I don't know, man. I think 5 to me makes a little bit more sense because while it is certainly a divisive entry in the franchise, to my knowledge, and I might get this slightly wrong, but I'm pretty confident in it, it's still the highest selling Resident Evil game ever. So I think if you're Capcom, you're looking at those original sales and you're looking at the fondness that people still have for some aspects. Like, people still talk about Chris punching a boulder and, you know, fighting Wesker in that game, all the stuff with Jill. You know, there are set pieces and beats within Resident Evil 5 that people love, although there are parts that people obviously don't like either. So I wonder if they're looking at the kind of general response and its general legacy combined with its sales and wondering if we can capitalize on the good parts people liked and then do what you said, overhaul the stuff that didn't quite work and maybe make for a more cohesive game. I don't know. I think it seems like a natural next step, though. Resident Evil 6, obviously, that's a huge question mark. I kind of don't want them to touch that. I don't really hate Resident Evil 6 as much as a lot of people do, but I think, for me, that's kind of a waste of resources because it took like 600 people or whatever it was to make that game in the first place.
Right.
So I'm just imagining the resources needed to not only remake it, but make it good. And I'm like, just do that on something else. Like, remake another game. Remake Resident Evil 0, Code Veronica.
That's a shout. That's a huge shout. It's just one of those things where, you know, over here you've got Golem saying that they have plans up until 2029, and as of a couple of years ago, we knew what the rollout was going to be. Obviously, the official announcements came later, but it was Resident Evil Village, it was Resident Evil 4 Remake. We sort of knew a few projects ahead of time.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where right now, even down the leaker side of things or the official side, we don't know what's next for Resident Evil, but we are in the middle of Capcom doing their whole Renaissance thing. Capcom is back, etc. Kind of offset by Exoprimal. Only 4,000 people playing that apparently.
But here's the thing, their Renaissance has always been offset by really bad multiplayer games. Like, we've had great Resident Evil games,
RE-verse
and then we've had like RE-verse and the other multiplayer mode that they put out for 3, which I can't remember. So it's like, in the single player realm, they're doing really good.
Which is what they need to stick to. Let's talk a bit more about Resident Evil 9 though, because that is the next, obviously, major installment. You had the DLC for Resident Evil 8, where you played as Rose. There was more sort of like powers and magic-y type stuff.
Yes, it was an experiment for sure.
Yeah, I mentioned the first third-person split as well, it's one of those things overall where it's like, you know, they've said that they were done with Ethan's story, but then he's kind of in Shadows of Rose, or at least he's at the end of Resident Evil 8. What do you think they do for RE9? Is it like a return to the STARS characters, or is it like, do we do something entirely different?
I think we kind of do another game set in that universe, because there's still some unanswered questions, especially with Chris and the BSAA, which is kind of gone rogue at the end of that using biohazard things. I don't know, it's really confusing the end of Resident Evil.
TerraSave.
But there's a lot of question marks hanging over the conclusion of that game. So I would like one more first-person game to kind of wrap up this trilogy. And that's just because, man, I feel like we get a Resident Evil pretty much every year.
Yeah.
And the remake side of things, I've said this before, but the remake side of things have the third-person style covered. You know, we get great third-person Resident Evil games from those. To me, it might be a little bit overkill if every Resident Evil game is in that format. I think they have a nice balance between first and third with these kind of two separate franchises ongoing. So I would want one more game in the first-person style, that being Resi 9, and then maybe stop the remakes for a little bit, and then go back to the third-person style with Resi 10 and kind of have that be a grand return, or, you know, maybe innovate in a completely different way. I don't know.
That's a really good point. The idea that like you don't want to have too much market saturation or just general tiredness with the IP by have everything be third person. And that is true. The fact that the remakes are so distinguishable is why I way prefer them. Like I love Resident Evil 7. Didn't vibe that much with RE8, but I absolutely adore 2, 3, and 4 remakes.
Yeah.
So it is one of those things where it's like they're running out of road when it comes to the remakes. They only really have 5, 6. I guess you could do Code Veronica or Resident Evil 0, but that's a way bigger overhaul. Or if you're doing the first person stuff, then that just is open territory, because that's the thing that we're just being the most experimental with.
Man, it's interesting. Like, I love Resident Evil in all of its forms, but the reason I love this franchise is because it constantly reinvents itself. Like, even when you think you know what Resident Evil is, it decides it wants to be a first-person horror game inspired by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Evil Dead. You know what I mean? It's always got this sense of reinvention and malleability, so that's why I never want to see it just adopt one style and kind of go into that wholesale. If I'm being personally extremely selfish, I want to return to the fixed camera angles. I want to return to that isometric sort of style of classic survival horror gameplay. Maybe not in a numbered release, but if we kind of run out a road with the remakes and we're kind of going down the first person route with the main installments, give me a throwback title, man. Like, give me something in that classic style, because I think that would be responded to well, especially when a bunch of indie games are kind of doing that right now and getting a lot of success. You look like Signalises and whatnot.
Yes.
So give me a Resi game in that style.
The Medium also did that too, like sort of like an insert spots in it. Do you know what they could do? The one thing that I completely forgot that exists is the Resident Evil Revelations games. There's only 2 of them.
Yes.
But the first one of them was very Cold Fear, a game that only 3 people know about. But Cold Fear was a very good ship-based horror that released on the PlayStation 2, and that was kind of in the vein of Resident Evil 4. And it's just that idea of like, you know, an isolated location, going through all the different horror trappings that come with that. Resident Evil Revelations is a very good version of, or a very good encapsulation of that kind of aesthetic. And doing that with the RE engine would be really cool. That could be just a little middle installment, kind of on the same level as Code Veronica, I would say.
That's another one that's been rumored for a while, I think. You know, we've seen Revelations 3 pop up here and there. It's never materialized yet, but yeah, that's a successful sub-franchise that, like you said, probably could continue with and be well received at that, because that's a great way, like the first 2 games, a great way of revisiting kind of classic characters who otherwise might not headline a Resident Evil game. Like, obviously you got Barry Burton in there and a bunch of others, so I think that's really a really interesting slice of the franchise's kind of history.
Speaking of multiplayer stuff, though, which kind of upends this thing, franchises that are built towards multiplayer can still work. Because we are talking about a Capcom announcement overall. It's easy to just think about Resident Evil, but Monster Hunter's in here too. Monster Hunter World was 2018, Monster Hunter Rise is 2021, and it got a PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series Systems remake, I think last year, late last year.
Yeah.
I'm a Switch boy, so I played it over there. But yeah, it's about time for a new Monster Hunter, a new main Monster Hunter. That game's been supported so much, and Monster Hunter World is by far, I think, Capcom's highest selling, highest grossing game, and Monster Hunter World is like a perfect video game. So it's one of those things where this could just be this could just be the next Monster Hunter.
Like you said, you know, it's their highest selling franchise by far. It's not something that I'm necessarily interested in, but it would make complete sense. Not even say it's bad, by the way, just not necessarily my type of game, but I want to see them make more because loads of people love it. It's on like a really hot streak at the moment, and especially when it comes to sales, it's selling hand over fist. People can't get enough of that franchise. So yeah, it does. I do think it makes sense for that to be the big announcement.
If we're talking about, I'll tell you another one I'm going to throw in here is the new Onimusha. This is an out of left field one, but they did do the Onimusha HD remake. It was like a re-release, but it was touched up. It was like a remaster, a good sort of 2 or 3 years ago, and it's nearly always a game industry rule that a remaster always comes before a new installment to sort of test the waters and see if people are interested. Now, maybe that thing didn't sell even remotely well for them to follow up on it, but 9 times out of 10, if there's a remaster, you know, being put out there, then it leads into a new installment. It's what was supposed to happen with the Prince of Persia remaster remake thing for the original, leading into the Lost Kingdom. But we obviously haven't heard anything about Onimusha, but it's one of those things where, as far as I know, they still have the trademark active. And Onimusha is another one where it came from the Resident Evil engine.
Yeah.
Do the RE engine, do the new version of it, Samanovsky, do all that stuff.
Go on, I would also
Do
love to
it.
see that. Give me some of these kind of... We've had the established Capcom franchises. Give us those Dino Crisises. Give us those Onimushas. Give us those older IPs that, you know, could become as big as the current crop that Capcom is banking on. I just kind of, like, always go back to the thing of how many developers do they have? How many resources do they have at their disposal? How many franchises can they realistically work on at the same time? Because I'll always go back to Devil May Cry. I'm like, why haven't we got a 6th game? And the answer is those developers are working on other projects. So if we can't even get a Devil May Cry, I'm like, we'll be getting Onimusha. I don't know.
It has been long enough for a DMC. Like, you could do another one. If we're talking about, you know, major announcements, new franchise stuff, then it probably is Dino Crisis, Onimusha, Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter, or Resident Evil. Hopefully it's one of those 5. But also, speaking of a good crop, check out this video right here for Si's full ranking of the entire Resident Evil franchise. I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com.
I've been Josh from WhatCulture.com.
And we'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.